I will introduce today's speaker, Dr. Annika Keeley. Dr. Keeley is a conservation scientist with expertise in ecological connectivity science and animal behavior. As a postdoctoral scholar at the University of California, Berkeley, she systematically reviewed the literature at the intersection of connectivity and climate change science and explored the challenges and opportunities for implementing connectivity in California and around the world. Dr. Keeley co-authored the second edition of the book Corridor Ecology and contributed substantially to the Connectivity Conservation Guidelines published by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. She is now with the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, where she provides science leadership and advises on connectivity projects and programs across the organization. She is also a member of the IUCN Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group. Now I will give the floor to Dr. Keeley.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm really excited to be here. It's such a privilege to get to share with you a topic that I'm really deeply invested in, that I love talking about. And I'm looking forward really to your questions afterwards and maybe comments. Maybe you can share your expertise. I'm planning to talk about 40 minutes, so we will definitely have time for that. And yeah, I hope I can share something with you that's of interest to you and that you can learn something from. So as Rebecca mentioned, I will be talking about some of the topics that are covered in this book, Corridor Ecology, that we published in 2019. And let's dive right in. The first, or actually, I want to give you an outline really quickly so you know where we are headed. I want to start out with giving you examples of corridors and to also talk about corridor designs. Often the question is, what actually is a corridor? How should we think about that? And there are different types of corridors, so I want to go into that. And then I'm going to talk about how climate change fits into all this. What does the tool of corridors mean in terms of climate change adaptation for animals and plants? And then I want to talk about where to protect corridors. How do we decide, where to do corridor conservation? And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about implementing corridors, and I do that using 4 different case studies from around the world. Let's think about what are corridors. What are good examples of corridors? This picture here shows a historical drovers road in Spain that is now an important corridor with multiple benefits. Drovers roads were essentially roads or broad areas where people used to drive their cattle from pasture to pasture or from summer to winter pastures. And a lot of these drovers roads are still in existence in Spain. They're not being used for that purpose much anymore, a little bit increasing again, but they are now really important for connectivity for wildlife and plants, and also for recreation. This here is a stretch of the former Iron Curtain. You can see on the right-hand side where it runs, and it has been transformed into the European Green Belt, which is just an amazing element in the landscape and an amazing fact that, this, what used to be a deadly border has been transformed into this element of life. And it's not very wide, but it is the area itself. The corridor has really good areas of intact nature, and it's really an important corridor connectivity zone in Europe now. Brazil is restoring its heavily fragmented Atlantic rainforest region, which is on the east coast and the eastern part of Brazil. Only 14% of this originally really diverse forest remains in patches, and connectivity efforts such as this that you can see here on the picture are efforts, these efforts really are hope that this habitat can be restored. The way it's sometimes done is that millions of trees literally are planted to to make a corridor between remaining protected areas. And often these are community efforts where the communities or people have the opportunity to start native plant nurseries and grow these trees. And then there are work programs and community efforts to have people plant literally like 5 million trees in one corridor that might be a couple hundred meters wide and connect protected areas then. And because it's, it's tropical, they grow really fast, and within 5 years, they can already have function as a corridor. Corridors don't have to be continuous. And here you can see an example of a stepping stone corridor. So these stepping stones have to be close enough together that animals can easily move between them, but then it can function as a stepping stone. And actually, if you think of migratory birds, there it looks even more different. There it's like very important to have stopover sites as stepping stones, but they don't have to be close together. It just has to be a really good network that allows birds to continue their migrations. And then we have riparian corridors. They are really commonly used as movement corridors by many species of animals and plants, and also terrestrial and aquatic species. And they are so important because they support important ecological processes. They provide cooler and moister microclimates than the immediate surrounding. They often enjoy popular support because of water quality and recreation benefits. And what is really nice is they don't require any modeling. We know where they are, right? You can just look at a map and see the riparian areas. And this makes it also easy to convey the importance and for community conservation efforts. In many places, riparian zones already have some legal protection, although the legal requirements may not be wide enough to support a full suite of species that could potentially benefit from the corridors. So there might be some adjustment necessary. Some species, of course, do not use riparian zones and might need upland corridors. So, they are very important, but they might not fulfill every species' connectivity requirements. The way to deal with that is to either have alternative corridors or to have really wide riparian corridors that include uplands. And then we have what I like to call landscape corridors. And landscape corridors increase ecological connectivity and benefit agricultural production and biodiversity at the same time. And you can see here on the picture on the left-hand side, the concept. So at the bottom and let me see here, at the bottom and at the top, you have forest patches. And then in the landscape corridor, there's a higher density of different landscape elements. You have small forest patches, you have hedgerows, and together they facilitate movement of forest-dependent species between the two large forest patches. Another example of this is the ecological corridor called Amistosa in Costa Rica that improves connectivity between two protected areas and maintains the ecosystem services for communities living in the corridor. So we saw examples of corridors like in Brazil and in Europe, where you essentially have somewhat linear stretch of corridor without, where we have natural areas. And then a very different concept, these landscape corridors where people can actually live in the corridors. They are typically much wider. They might be, 2, 3, 10 kilometers wide, but people can actually live in these corridors, work in these corridors, but by ensuring that they are managed in a way that's conducive to connectivity for wildlife, for plants, they still have a connectivity function and can be really important. Agricultural benefits can be pollination, can be pest control, protection from wind or water erosion, water quality, and water quantity. So really important to have these two different or very different examples of corridors in mind as we go forward. Corridors may also be needed for seasonal movements, such as migrations. And in that case, there may be human activities within the corridor that might be incompatible with the species during migration, but otherwise acceptable. And then we have crossings. So corridors versus crossings. How do we, is it the same? Is it different? And essentially, wildlife crossings are human-built infrastructure, like bridges, like tunnels, culverts, that are designed to help wildlife safely cross the roads or railways or canals. And if the highway is the only obstacle fragmenting habitat, we can call the crossing the corridor. Or it can be, a crossing can be part of the corridor, making sure that there's not a barrier to movement in the corridor. Careful corridor design can increase the chance that connectivity goals will actually be achieved. And I just want to talk about some corridor design goals that should be considered. In general, habitat quality, habitat continuity, and the dimensions of the corridor, as well as the landscape context, will affect overall utility of the corridor. If facilitating movement of a specific species or a suite of species is the focus, then of course we need to consider their habitat preferences, their dispersal behavior, how far can they move easily, and other life history features in the design process. And corridor design goals should be to provide live-in and move-through habitat for multiple species. So they should be wide enough to provide live-in habitat for species with dispersal distances shorter than the linkage. Think of, let's say some species of mouse living there. There's no way that they could move through a 10-kilometer long corridor in a day. They need to be able to actually live in the corridor and be able to essentially move over a few generations from one protected area to another. So thinking about live-in habitat can be really important. Similarly, it's important to consider supporting metapopulations of smaller species, which may require dozens of generations to move between target areas. And then corridors should be designed to provide resources for all target species, such as host plants for butterflies and pollinators for plants. So when restoring a corridor, like the example in Brazil, it's really important to be very deliberate and think through what species to actually plant in the corridor to ensure that the needs are met for all the target species. And then corridors should be designed to buffer against edge effects, such as pets, cats and dogs coming into the corridor can be a disturbance. And thinking about how wide it should be, so there's an area protected from that influence, might be important. Other edge effects can be lighting, noise, nest predation, and parasitism. I'm thinking about brown-headed cowbirds. They really like to be at the edges of forests and would be at the edges of corridors, and also invasive species. So that's something to take into consideration as for designing these corridors. And then for riparian corridors, it's really important to reduce the contaminants in streams. There was this really interesting study, I think it was done in Washington State, where they showed that the wash off from an interstate, from the tires mostly, is really toxic to the salmon in the stream. And there's a really, having essentially a buffer zone can take care of a lot of that. It can capture it and keep it from running into the water. So upland buffer zones are needed along key riparian corridors to prevent the degradation of aquatic habitat, depending on what habitat is adjacent to the corridors. And then corridors should also allow natural processes of disturbance and recruitment to operate with minimal constraints from adjacent urban areas. And finally, corridors should allow species and natural communities to respond to climatic changes. And I'll talk about that in more detail later. Corridors, of course, are not standalone landscape elements, but they are really part or should be part of what are called ecological networks for conservation. And the idea is, you can see it in this somewhat messy graphic here, is that there's a whole system of different protected areas, dark green on land and dark blue in the ocean, and also other effective area-based conservation measures shown in this brown color. And they all should be connected either directly to each other or by corridors. So really form a network for nature. A critical question that has not been completely answered yet is how wide corridors should be to meet conservation objectives. But recently, there has been Dr. Paul Bayer, who has been working on connectivity for many decades, came up with a rule of thumb based on all the science that has been done based on his experience. And that is that a width of 2 kilometers is appropriate when the corridor is intended to connect protected areas that are up to 80 kilometers apart in a landscape that is likely to experience impact from development in the future. So that seems really wide, but if you imagine two areas 80 kilometers apart, what is that, about 60 miles maybe? Then you really need a good stretch of land for animals to live in to be able to move that distance for over generations. Of course, for mobile species, it might not be as necessary, but if you think of all the habitat specialists and of species that do need to live in the corridor, 2 kilometers wide seems like a good width. And we do need still empirical evidence, though, to help planners and managers decide on appropriate corridor widths in different scenarios. And the good news is that there's actually a project underway that is studying many landscapes around the world, and they are doing genetic analyses of focal species to figure out what kind of corridors are promoting movement by different species. And the goal of this study is to be able to formulate these recommendations of how wide corridors need to be in different scenarios. So research is being done, but right now we just have this rule of thumb. How does climate change fit into all this? Well, we have this tool, right? Corridors, permeable landscapes. And this tool is supposed to facilitate processes, daily movements, gene flow, seasonal migrations. And with climate change, it's also supposed to facilitate range shifts, or can be used to facilitate range shifts. And the outcomes are increased population viability, and with climate change are now climate resilience as well. There are a few different approaches to designing corridors that can help species move or adapt. None of them are perfect, but they all offer some improvement over traditional approaches that ignore climate change. So the first one is the idea that core habitats that we want to remain connected may shift through time. So in this figure here, you see on the left-hand side, the dark green area, which is, let's say, the current habitat of a species that we're interested in. Over time, this core area will shift as the climate is changing. And it looks like it's shifting northward and it's contracting in size. But what's really important is that over time, there will be a connection between the original space and the future space. So individual animals can actually move that from the original extent, from the original range to the future range. So this is one concept that corridors can help with, is the range shifts. Let's think a little bit more about range shifts. The mean rate of range expansion at the leading edges for marine species is 70 kilometers per decade about. So, species that were at the northern edge, let's say right at the border between Mexico and California, in 2010, they would be 70 kilometers further north. That's how fast they are shifting their range. The rate of expansion in terrestrial systems is much lower for different reasons. One is that the dispersal ability is limited for many species. They just can't move as easily, as far. There's lower fecundity. On average, species in the ocean have more offspring than species on land. And then there are barriers associated with caused by land use change, right? Highways need to be crossed. Intensive agriculture areas can be barriers, same as urban areas. So land use change really decreases the rate of expansion in terrestrial systems. The most common climate corridor design approach, so, figuring out where we should really consider connecting areas to enable these range shifts. The most common design approach is based on species distribution models. And these models predict where species occur based on climate variables. So we can model a species' current distribution, then we can model their future distribution using climate change projections, and then we can design corridors that link the current and future habitat patches. In the map shown here is an example of this approach. Researchers used species distribution models to map current and future habitat for several thousand species of birds, of mammals, and of amphibians. And then they modeled the best corridors between them. And the colored lines here on the map show where these climate corridors overlap for the highest number of species. And these are the corridors that are likely to be useful for facilitating range shifts for many species. And you probably already noticed this area right here, where a lot of these lines converge, and that's the Appalachian corridor. So it's really pointing out the amazingly great importance of this region of the Appalachian corridor as a climate corridor. And the good thing is people have recognized that. And it's actually called now the Eastern Climate Corridor. And the Appalachian Trail has existed for 100 years already. And there are efforts underway to develop the second 100-year vision for this region, and partially based on the importance as a climate corridor. And of course, it's a huge landscape, right? The Appalachian Trail is over 3,000 kilometers long, 3,525 kilometers, or 2,190 miles. It's the watershed for 190 million people. So, there are a lot of people benefiting from it, living in it. And it's really a globally important landscape for carbon, for biodiversity, and for water. All right, so this was the first approach to designing corridors for climate change. The second approach is related, and that is to connect climate analogs. So climate analogs are sites with today's climate that match with sites that may have a similar climate regime in the future, making the two geographically separated sites analogs to one another. So before we were talking about species ranges, right? Now we're talking about generally the climate in different sites, so not species specific. And to make that point really clear or more easily understandable is to think about what it means for us humans. So under current high emissions, the average urban dweller is going to have to drive more than 500 miles to the south to find a climate similar to their home city by 2080. Meaning that in 2080, the climate in Minneapolis, for example, is going to be similar to the current climate in Oklahoma and Kansas. And the climate in Washington, D.C. in 2080, going to be similar to the current climate in Northeast Texas. So corridors can be designed to connect climate analog sites. Another thing that corridors can do to help species deal with climate change is that they can span environmental gradients. So sometimes it might mean to have to make them wider maybe it means to route them in a different way. But if they can include environmental gradients, such as, going up slope, means that it's a gradient of warmer to higher temperatures. Including a stream means you have the gradient of being further away and closer to the stream, or being close to a coast can be a gradient, an environmental gradient. And including these gradients into corridors can allow species to not have to move as far, but really shift their location within the corridor and make it easier for more species to use the corridor. And then finally, and again related to the previous one, corridors can incorporate climate refugia. And so topographically complex terrain offers a diversity of microclimates, and species then can persist in a region because individuals can make small shifts in location. If you are an outdoor person, and I bet most of you are, or if you have a garden, you realize that some places are much cooler than others. So if a corridor can offer a lot of diversity of microclimates, it really makes it easier for species to persist in these corridors and take best advantage of them. Really quickly, what are examples of climate refugia? This picture shows it really nicely for a mountainous landscape in a way, but then there are a lot of elements that you find in many places. Canopy cover can be a climate refugia. Northward facing slopes, areas near or in dark, deep lakes or in oceans, and then deep snowdrifts and valleys where cold air pools. Those are all examples of climate refugia. Now that we know all about what corridors are and what are important considerations in their design, let's explore how to decide where to protect corridors. And there's a whole series of steps to identify and then prioritize corridors. The first one is to define the ecological objectives, and that can be facilitating movement of individual species, of individual species. It can be genetic exchange. It can be migration. It can be multi-generational movement. Think of monarch butterflies migrating. It can be maintaining or restoring processes. Think of pollination or hydrological connectivity in rivers. It can be climate change adaptation to facilitate range shifts of species. It can be the enhancement of recovery, to serve as a source of conifer seeds for restoring native trees in logged areas or after wildfires. Those are all possible ecological objectives, and being really clear on what the objective of a corridor is important when identifying and prioritizing them. The next step is to define what should be connected. It can be protected areas only, but it can also be, unprotected natural areas, forest fragments. It can be summer range to winter range. It can be aquatic breeding areas of toads to the upland areas where they spend the rest of the year, or salamanders. And if you think large scale, it can be the coast to the mountain. And then the next step is to either select focal species or to decide on a structural connectivity approach. And I go into a little bit more detail here. Thinking about focal species, many corridors have been many corridor designs have been based solely on large charismatic species. And this may be appropriate when and if these species are suffering from loss of connectivity, and the objective of the corridor is to recover the species. And these charismatic species can also be really powerful flagship species, able to rally the support of the public and other stakeholders. I just saw a great talk on a jaguar corridor in Colombia, and they actually after failing with a rather mechanistic science-based approach, they decided to involve the community and established a jaguar festival. And it was all about jaguars. And the community came on board and is now supporting the corridor effort. So it can be a really powerful way to use a flagship species to rally the support of the public and other stakeholders. But several studies have tested whether corridors designed for these species will also provide connectivity for other species, and they thereby serve as an umbrella species for connectivity planning purposes. However, these studies produced varying results. Sometimes it worked, and sometimes a lot of species were left out. So generally, a safer approach is to select a whole suite of focal species, including the flagship species. Things to consider when selecting species is that we should really think about species with limited dispersal capabilities. We should think about habitat specialists. We should think about species that are important for ecological processes, such as pollination. We should think about species that are sensitive to barriers, and also keystone species that have an outsized impact on their environment, such as beavers. So those are all species that could be considered as focal species when planning corridors. An example of an effort that has taken that approach is in the San Francisco Bay Area in California. And on this map here in dark green, you can see the large landscape blocks that are supposed to be connected. And in light green, you see the corridors that have been modeled based on a suite of over 50 species, some of which you can see here in the pictures. Alternatively to using a suite of focal species, we can focus on conserving structural connectivity based on natural land cover types. And structural connectivity is a measure of habitat permeability based on the physical features and arrangements of habitat patches presumed to be important for organisms to move through the environment. Here you can see structural connectivity. You have the forest patches up on the hills, and then your eye can already detect the elements that provide structural connectivity. It's all the hedgerows, the riparian areas, the trees along the road. That's structural connectivity. Functional connectivity, on the other hand, is the degree to which evidence indicates that landscapes actually facilitate or impede the movement of organisms. So functional connectivity is very species specific. What might be connected for one species will not be connected for another species. Think of a cliff in mountains. For humans, I would say that they have a really hard time moving across it, unless you have ropes and a good amount of training. But for lizards, it's easy to navigate. Connectivity is definitely a species-specific concept. So, and for functional connectivity, you really need the evidence that the landscape facilitates movement of organisms. Sometimes, of course, structural connectivity equals functional connectivity. For example, for forest-dependent species in a landscape like this. And if we think back to the discussion of range shifts and how much faster they occur in the ocean because there are no barriers to movement, we can assume that areas with a low human footprint will facilitate range shifts of species that are sensitive to human disturbance better than areas with a high human footprint. So corridors that have a high level of naturalness likely facilitate movement of many species, especially if they are wide enough and include different landscape elements. So you can take the approach of thinking about focal species, or you can try to find corridors with a high level of naturalness to decide where to protect corridors. Two different approaches. All right, the next step is to create resistance maps. And I want to briefly talk into this because it's the basis of many connectivity models that you might encounter. It can be a really complicated scientific endeavor to create these resistance maps and model connectivity, but it's not that hard to understand. So I will attempt to share it with you in a way that that makes sense and that will help you later interpret and understand maps that you might encounter. So resistance maps. Resistance is the degree to which the landscape facilitates or impedes movement. And you can see here, imagine this being a landscape, a study landscape, and you have the origin and the destination that you want to connect with a corridor. And then you divide the entire landscape into grid cells, and you give each grid cell a resistance value. So it shows, how easily an animal may move through this grid cell in the landscape. There are many different ways to figure out what the resistance values are. And one way, an example from a study I conducted on elk in Arizona is shown here. And so it's based on expert opinion. So experts were thinking through this. If you have a grid cell with forest or woodland, an elk would really have no hard time at all moving through it. So resistance is low, just gets a 1. And then, but if you think about developed areas of medium and high intensity, towns or cities, elk usually don't move through there. So resistance is really high. And so going through all the different land covers and thinking through what it means for elk movement is how experts arrive at these resistance values. And we can think about land cover, but then distance to roads also may matter. So 0 to 100 meters from the road, resistance is really high, right? They might cross the road occasionally, but generally they avoid the area. But as you get further away, up to 15 kilometers from the road, resistance goes down. And of course, again, these resistance values are species specific, and different ways to arrive at them is to use either camera traps that tell you how the animals are moving a landscape, or the best way really is to use GPS collars and use that data and then some somewhat complex models to figure out, what is the resistance of the different land cover types, of the different elements in the landscape to movement. And then alternatively, if you're thinking about naturalness or human impact and you want to base your connectivity on that, you would give a grid cell with high naturalness, a low resistance value, and a grid cell with low naturalness with high human impact, a high resistance value. And then the next step is, once you created the resistance layer, is to choose the most appropriate model to find existing pathways to model these corridors. And the most commonly used one is probably the least cost path model, and I'll go into depth in a second. And then I just want to throw out a few words because you might encounter them, but I will not go into depth in those. Circuitscape, omniscape, resistance kernel, individual-based modeling are all approaches to model pathways. So, people are really creative, scientists are really creative, and they don't stop when they have one solution, but they are going to improve and find different ways that may work better over time. But the most frequently used approach is the least cost corridor approach. And you can see it hopefully nicely demonstrated here. So we have our resistance map. We want to connect origin to destination. And the algorithm actually finds the least cost path. So you can see really clearly in this example, it finds the path where the animals only have to cross grid cells that have a low resistance value of 2. And then to get to a corridor, this is only one grid cell wide. It could be, a 10-meter grid cell, could be a 300-meter grid cell. But what's really important is to extend that to make it a corridor and have it the width that you are interested in and figure out the best corridor in the landscape. And the result from these exercises are corridor maps. So on the upper right, you can see in dark green, again, the areas that were supposed to be connected, and in light green, the corridors. And then different representations in the other maps. Actually, in the lower right, what was retained is the areas where corridors are crossing highways, and where mitigation of highways would be really important to increase connectivity. All right, the final decision then on where to act depends really on a wide variety of issues. And so it's really important, you saw in this map here, there are a lot of corridors that need attention, but usually capacity is limited, resources are limited, and we need to at least figure out where to act first. And so prioritizing corridors is the next step. And important considerations when prioritizing corridors are, of course, the importance for species conservation, right? How important is it to maintain movement in the different corridors, or what role, how important is a corridor to continue providing connectivity for species? Another consideration, though, is the economic cost of the conservation action needed. And also, the probability that existing connectivity areas will be lost if no action is taken. So considering the likelihood of future land use change due to development that may result in conversion and habitat loss can be important to consider. If there's a critical area that people want to develop very soon, it might be important to focus on that first. And then, of course, the benefit for climate resilient landscapes can be considered too. The type of corridor modeling, it can be really involved, it can be really scientific, but it produces maps of potential corridors, but it's based on geographic map layers. And like all models, they may be helpful, but they may be wrong. And they definitely contain a good deal of uncertainties due to errors in the digital data, problems with the assumptions inherent in the modeling effort. And so prior to any conservation action in an area, it is really important to conduct field visits and talk to local experts to assess the potential utility of the identified corridors. For case studies, and the first one is, again, the Appalachian corridor. One key lesson that was learned in this for actually getting connectivity conservation done is that conservation easements are a really important tool to permanently secure connectivity on private lands in the US. And here in this slide, you can see in the northern Green Mountains linkage area in Jackson Valley, shown in orange, it's an important corridor. And since 2012, a conservation easement prevents development and subdivision in the ecological corridor and requires sustainable management for wildlife, timber, public recreation, and soil conservation. Another example is here a case study about conserving long-distance migration for mule deer in Wyoming. And the key lesson was that scientific studies documented migratory corridors for wildlife, resulting in the purchase of private lands that otherwise would have been developed. And this corridor I already mentioned in Costa Rica. And here, municipal land management plans are a key tool for implementing ecological corridors. And these management plans generate the guidelines necessary to allow human development activities to be carried out while maintaining connectivity. And my last slide is about aquatic corridors and the importance of dams or removing dams, because they impair connectivity of the headwaters to the ocean, and removing them can restore biotic and abiotic processes and benefit fisheries. And with that, I really thank you for listening. Looking forward to your questions. And if you have any additional questions later, please feel free to contact me. And if you want to learn more, this book here that the presentation is based on is a really good resource.
Okay, I wanted to share with you, Dr. Keeley, a couple of questions that we have here in the chat. One is from a Mr. David Morgan, what is your recommendation for considering corridors in urban settings?
That's a really good question, and there is some amazing work being done. Corridors in urban settings can have so many additional benefits, not just for biodiversity conservation, but for people. You know, if you think of rivers flowing through through cities in the past, they often have been routed underground, and efforts more and more are getting the rivers back to the surface and actually creating corridors for wildlife, but also really nice areas for, you know, for recreation, um, for feeling better for humans and using for humans to use them in the cities. And I think mostly there, though, there's so many restrictions, right? And it's just important to think about what's possible and look at examples that have done a lot of things. Actually, an example from Toronto is there's a power line that goes through the city, a big one, and the area underneath is not developed. And so the city of Toronto is actually restoring that area as a corridor for, you know, for insects mostly, actually, because they can have trees there, but it's a great meadow ecosystem now, and people love recreating in it as well. So there are quite a few options thinking about where rivers or streams flow through, where there are power lines, where there are parks that may be able to be connected. And another thing, though, is, you know, to think about yards and get people involved and plant native plants, because you can have stepping stone connectivity in cities as well. And the more yards you have with native plants in parks as well, the more connectivity you have. Green roofs is another thing to consider. If that's an option, they can serve as stepping stone corridors. So there are quite a few options in cities.
Thank you for that, Dr. Keeley. I have another question from Nina Shippen. Are flyways used by migrating birds considered corridors? Then she goes on to say she worries about the impact of things like motorized gliders, night lighting, windmills on migrating birds and insects.
Yeah, this is a really good question, and one we're struggling with to some extent. You know, we talk about actually connectivity and then corridors. And corridors is one tool to promote connectivity. And it can't, you know, it can't do everything. So the way I was talking about corridors was mostly focused, first of all, on terrestrial biomes, and then mostly focused on continuous corridors. There are stepping stones. People who work with migratory species really like to think about these stepping stone corridors for migrating birds, but it's a somewhat separate concept. And so it's really important, though, and as you mentioned, you know, collisions with windows, with power lines, and is all interfering with connectivity. I would put that into a little bit different tool category than corridors in general, but definitely very important for connectivity.
I will share one additional question from Nina Shippen. Is anyone doing work on applying corridor ecology on a residential scale or in residential areas?
Yes, so like I mentioned, in cities, it is being done. I think a good example is Houston, Texas. If you want to Google that, there's quite a bit happening. I think the Denver metro area is engaged in connectivity efforts with, you know, in residential areas. Actually, my husband is working for a native plant nursery in Sacramento, and their goal is to increase the number of yards with native plants, partially to provide connectivity for species in the city. And then you can actually, a lot of neighborhoods, you know, have the back alleys, And they could be really thought of as corridors, and they could be improved in amazing ways, together with the yards, that, residents could come together and really think about this and develop a vision and increase habitat and connectivity in residential neighborhoods. So there are efforts happening at different scales, and if you want to contact me directly, I'm happy to send you some examples or connect you to people too, if you would like.
And we are actually reaching the end of the hour. So again, Dr. Keeley, I would like to thank you for joining us today for this wonderful webinar. I'd also like to thank all of our participants for joining us today. Thanks again, everyone, for attending, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you all. Thank you, Rebecca.